I sat in the front row of the ceremony hall, still in disbelief that my name had made it this far up the list. Lieutenant Colonel. My name Lena Ashcroft, stitched in clean black thread on the uniform that still smelled faintly of starch and determination. I was 36, young by most standards, exceptionally young by military ones. The youngest in my class to hold this rank. I should have felt proud, maybe triumphant, but as I scanned the rows of occupied chairs behind me, faces I knew from briefings fieldwork and years of climbing uphill, I felt something else. Not surprise, not anymore. Just that quiet, settled understanding that this moment wasn't going to be for them. I watched the other honorees before me accept their promotions. Applause, camera flashes. Some had children waving from the back, spouses beaming beside them, parents crying quietly in the front. I had my empty chair. I had the silence. No one came for me, not Mum, not Dad, not Ariel. I guess I stopped expecting them to show up somewhere around my 3rd year in service. The first 2 I still sent invites. A graduation from officer training, my first deployment ceremony. They replied late, always with the same message, wish you the best. Be careful. Proud in our own way. But no plane ticket, no phone call, and absolutely no seat saved for them. When the general called my name, I stood. My boots echoed louder than I thought they would on the stage. I walked toward him, every step rehearsed. I saluted, and he returned it with a nod of respect. Lieutenant Colonel Lena Ashcroft, he said into the mic. A few people clapped. I heard someone whistle lightly from the back. I took the certificate, shook his hand, and smiled. Not wide, just enough. As I turned to face the crowd, they told us to stand proudly, so photographers could get their shots. My eyes landed for a moment on the section where guests were seated. Families, support systems, my space still blank. Not even a friend sitting in for them. The guy beside me nudged gently as if to say, "Smile, it's your day." I nodded, gave the smallest upturn of my mouth I could manage, and turned back. Afterward, there was a small reception in the adjoining room. Lemon bars on white paper doilies, small plastic cups of cranberry punch. I stood near the corner table, hands behind my back, as a few colleagues stopped by to say congratulations. One of the captains I used to work with raised his cup toward me and said, "Big day, your family must be proud." I looked at him, held that moment of silence for a beat too long, then smiled. "They don't really do uniforms." He chuckled awkwardly, not sure if I was joking. I didn't clarify, just turned slightly and let the conversation drift towards someone else. I don't resent them for not coming. Not anymore. There was a time, maybe in my early 20s, when I held out hope that one day they'd walk through those doors, Mom in her lecture outfit, Dad with his polished shoes and clinical watchfulness. Ariel arms crossed, pretending she didn't care, but sneaking glances at me. That hope got thinner each year. Eventually, it disappeared altogether. I learned not to expect applause from people who only ever saw you through their own filter of disappointment. I wasn't the doctor they wanted. I wasn't the therapist. I wasn't the image they pictured in their framed degrees and quiet dinners. I was the one who walked away. It's strange what stays with you. Not the ceremony, not the speeches, but a voice low and off to the side asking a question. Someone, maybe a new recruit, maybe someone's spouse, leaned over and whispered to a colonel beside him. "Why is she alone up there?" The colonel just shrugged. I stood straighter, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Being alone isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quietest, most consistent thing about you. It shows up in small ways, in how you learn to stand still when others expect you to turn around, in how you smile just enough to get through a room, in how you stop explaining your choices and instead let your life speak for itself. I didn't come to the military looking for a family. I came because I needed something to believe in that wasn't handed down in a lecture or written on a whiteboard. I needed to know that effort mattered more than bloodline, that if I worked hard enough, earned it hard enough, it would be mine. And now it was Lieutenant Colonel. No one clapped louder for me than I did in my own head, and somehow that was enough. When the room started to empty, I stayed behind for a few minutes. The janitor began folding up chairs. I walked back up to the stage, looked out at the empty seats, took a deep breath. No applause, no flowers, no family hugs. But there was my name, my rank, my record. I belonged to it, and it belonged to me. I stepped off the stage slowly, the hum of cleanup noises in the background. Folding chairs clacked together. Voices faded into distant chatter. I didn't rush. I never rushed when I didn't have to. The silence was a kind of company, now predictable, familiar, and oddly comforting. It reminded me of home, or at least what used to be home. The silence between me and Ariel had always been different, more loaded, thicker. Ariel was the kind of daughter who fit well into the mould, honours student, polished, smiling just enough, but not too much. When she walked into a room, people saw what they expected, a reflection of the people who raised her. My parents adored her for that. She made it easy for them to believe they were doing everything right. I wasn't surprised when she was admitted early to the psychology program at the same university where Mum taught. That was the plan since she was about 12. What surprised me was when she told me in a whisper one night when I came home for Thanksgiving that she'd always wanted to be an architect. She said it casually, like it didn't matter, as she handed me mashed potatoes across the table. No one else heard it. No one ever did. Why didn't you tell them? I asked, keeping my voice low. She didn't even look up. You saw how they reacted to you. And that was it. That one line held everything. Her fear, her resentment, her decision to stay inside the lines. And maybe deep down, her disappointment in herself and in me. She watched me fall out of their favour, like it was a slow-motion scene she couldn't turn away from. I think part of her believed she was next if she ever slipped. So she didn't. She followed every direction like it was law, smiled at the right moments, nodded through every lecture, agreed with every plan made for her. When I left for the academy, Ariel didn't cry. She hugged me tight and short and whispered, "Just be safe." But I could tell she didn't want me to go, not because she needed me, but because my leaving meant being left alone with the pressure of being the good one. After I graduated from basic, I sent her a photo of me in uniform. She replied with a thumbs up emoji. No words! I think she thought I was just going through a phase, like I'd get tired of all the drills and sweat and rules, and eventually come back home, apologise, and do something respectable. Maybe teach or marry someone my parents approved of. But I didn't. And every year that I stayed gone, that I moved up, that I built something real. Without them, it chipped away at something inside her. She was the golden child. But gold is heavy when you're carrying it for someone else. There was a photo in our living room growing up. It sat on the mantel in a wooden frame. Ariel, at age 5, in a ballet costume, smiling too hard. Mom said she looked like a tiny professional. Dad said she had discipline. They loved telling that story. I never saw them look at her and ask, "Do you actually like this?" They didn't ask me that either. The thing is, Ariel wasn't fake. She wasn't manipulative. She wasn't cruel. She was scared. And in our house, fear looked like obedience. I don't think she hated me for leaving. I think she hated herself a little more for staying. As the years passed, we drifted not through arguments, but through avoidance. Calls got shorter, texts more infrequent. The last time we really talked, she mentioned a new research project she was on with Mom. I congratulated her. She didn't ask what I was doing. Sometimes I wondered what she told people about me. Did she say I was in the military? Did she lie and say I work for some government office? Did she talk about me at all? When we were kids, we used to play this game where we'd pretend to be lost in the woods. I'd lead, she'd follow, always just one step behind. But now I was leading a life she couldn't admit she wanted. And that kind of truth is hard to forgive. People think the hardest part about being misunderstood is the rejection. But it's not. It's the loneliness that comes from knowing that the people who should know you best chose not to. I saw Ariel at a medical conference once years ago. I was there on assignment in civilian clothes. She was speaking on a panel with Mum. I sat in the back, watched her on stage, polished, articulate, flawless. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and chose to look away. I left before the Q&A. That day, I realised Ariel wasn't just my sister. She was also the mirror our parents looked into every day. And I had become the crack in the reflection. I don't blame her. Not fully. I know what it costs to say no to people who raised you. But I also know what it gives you the chance to be more than a trophy on someone else's shelf. In a way, we were both disappointments. I just chose mine. She inherited hers. That line kept me company more times than I care to admit. We were both disappointments, just in different packaging. And that thought followed me back to one night that always sticks out, not because something dramatic happened, but because everything didn't. It was about 8 years ago. I had come home for a rare dinner. I was already enlisted a few years into service, not yet on deployment, but far enough in that the military had begun shaping me into someone they barely recognised. I'd worn my uniform on purpose, not to make a point, but to see just once if they would ask about it, if they'd acknowledge the version of me that didn't fit their script. I walked into the dining room with the smell of overcooked salmon in the air. Ariel was already seated, napkin on her lap, smiling faintly like always. Mom was at the counter, arranging a salad like she was styling a photo shoot, and Dad had just poured himself a glass of that expensive mineral water he only broke out for guests or when he needed to seem refined. When I stepped through the doorway, their eyes caught on the uniform immediately. Not a word of welcome, not even a nod. Mum's first reaction, almost automatic, was, "Do you have to wear that at the table?" I glanced down at the crisp collar, the insignia just below my shoulder. "Didn't pack anything else," I said, sitting down. She made a tight sound in her throat. "It's just, the colour doesn't suit you. Makes you look tired." Ariel shot me a look, half apology, half warning, and reached for the bread basket. "The salmon smells good," she said, trying to change the subject. Dad took the bait immediately. "Ariel's been doing some incredible work at the lab," he said, turning toward her. "She co-authored that new paper with your mother, presented at the symposium last month." I nodded because what else was I supposed to do? "That's great," he went on for a bit, praising her, asking questions, talking shop, in a way that made her uncomfortable even if she'd never say so. I sat there slicing through overcooked fish with a dull knife, listening to a conversation I wasn't meant to join. They never asked what I'd been doing. "No, how's training?" or "Are you eating enough?" or "What's the next step in your service?" Nothing. Ariel gave me another quick look when Dad excused himself to take a call, and Mum went into the kitchen to check the oven. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," I shrugged. "Not your fault. You could have worn something else," she said, but she didn't mean it like an accusation, more like an exhausted peacekeeper trying to keep the air from cracking. I didn't reply. I just kept eating. After dinner, the unspoken rule kicked in. Ariel stayed with Mom in the living room, talking about a Netflix documentary they both pretended to care about. Dad was still on his cool, pacing by the study door. I collected the plates, scraped leftovers into the bin, and started washing up. I always ended up at the sink. Ever since we were kids, it was my corner of invisibility. No one disturbed me there. No one talked down to me at the faucet. As the water ran warm over my hands, I stared through the window above the sink out into the backyard, where Dad had once taught us to catch fireflies. That version of him felt like a stranger now, someone from another timeline. The clink of dishes in the drying rack was the only sound in the room. My uniform sleeves were rolled slightly damp at the edges. My name tag caught the light above the sink. Ashcroft, all caps, firm, unbending. No one asked me what it meant to wear that name differently than they had intended. No one noticed that I hadn't taken a single photo with them that night. Later, as I packed to leave, Mum handed me a small container of leftovers. "You can eat this tomorrow," she said. Her tone was civil. Not warm, not cold, just obligatory. "Thanks," I said. "We're glad you stopped by," she added after a pause. "Just maybe next time wear something more neutral." I nodded, said nothing more. In the car, I placed the container on the passenger seat like it was a placeholder for a conversation we were never going to have. That dinner wasn't a breaking point. It wasn't loud or final. It was quiet erosion. The kind that wears you down, meal by meal, year by year, until you stop hoping for something else. It taught me something important, though, that sometimes survival doesn't look like winning arguments or making them understand. Sometimes it looks like rinsing dishes, rolling down sleeves, and walking away before you say something you'll regret. Sometimes survival is silence. Silence had been my strategy long before the military taught me discipline. I learned early that some fights weren't worth having, not because they didn't matter, but because they were rigged from the start. But there was one night when I broke that rule. Just once. And even now, I still remember the sound of it. Not loud, not dramatic, just the sharp, deliberate clink of a decision dropping into the middle of a perfectly curated life. It was the week after my 18th birthday. I had waited for the letter for months. I knew the military academy's response would come mid-May, and when I saw the envelope in the mailbox, I felt a kind of electric buzz under my skin. I didn't open it right away. I held it in my hand through dinner prep, through small talk, through the ritualistic serving of chicken and steamed broccoli. Then, right as my dad folded his napkin and my mum reached for her glass of white wine, I said I got in. They looked up, to where my mum asked her tone neutral, but already bracing. "Westmont Military Academy," I said. "They've offered me a spot in the fall class. I'm going in August." It was like the thermostat dropped 10 degrees. My mum blinked. "You applied without telling us?" I nodded. Dad's mouth tightened. "And you accepted just like that?" "Yes." Mum set her glass down. "We talked about pre-med. You said you were thinking about psychology." "I changed my mind," I said. "A while ago." My dad leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on mine like he was trying to x-ray my intentions. "You want to crawl through mud and take orders for a living. You think this is brave, it's pathetic." I didn't flinch. "I think it's the first real decision I've made for myself." He snorted. "You want to be like my brother Jared. That's your hero, the guy who came back with a messed up leg, drank through his pension, and died alone in a one-bedroom. He served with integrity," I said, my voice low, but steady. "He chose something real." "Real," my dad's voice was a slow burn now. "Real is staying home and building a life that means something, not signing up to be a bullet sponge." Mom tried to interject, her voice suddenly calm. "You've always been smart, Lena. You could do something meaningful. Mental health is important. You could help people." "I don't want to help people the way you want me to," I said. "I want to live something that's mine, that I chose. I want to be tested." Dad stood up. "Don't expect me to come to your graduation." "I won't," I said, not out of spite, just fact. He walked out, just left. Mum stayed sitting, eyes on the table. She didn't say another word. I sat there too, the envelope still unopened on the placemat. We ate in silence, the kind that didn't fill the room, it swallowed it. Later that night in my room, I opened the letter. I read the offer 3 times as if repeating it would make it feel more real. Candidate Ashcroft, "We are pleased to offer you admission." I whispered it out loud. No one knocked on my door to ask. No one checked in. 2 days later, I started a checklist. Boots, paperwork, physicals, immunisations. I packed slowly, methodically. Ariel hovered sometimes, watching, saying nothing. Then, one night she came in while I was folding a set of shirts. She leaned against the doorframe. "You're really doing this?" "Yeah." She picked up a shirt, then set it back down. "They're going to hate you for it. They already do." "No," she said. "They're just scared." I laughed a little. "They're scared I won't fail. That's the real problem." She didn't argue. When I left, I took a cab. No one offered to drive me. Mum handed me a sealed envelope with my birth certificate and insurance info. She said, "Try not to lose this." Dad wasn't even home. The cab ride to the train station felt longer than it was. I watched the trees pass, thought about everything I hadn't said, but I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad. Just finished. Like I'd finally stepped off the stage of someone else's life. That night, sitting alone on the train, the city fading behind me, I realised what my first uniform would really mean. It wasn't just a job. It was a rejection of everything that had tried to define me without my permission. It was the beginning of my silence, but on my terms. Years passed in the academy and in early assignments, and the silence stayed with me until one afternoon I saw it again, a social media photo notification. Ariel had shared a post, my graduation photo, from my unit's promotion ceremony, the one they never attended, with the caption, "Proud of my big sister." Beneath it, dozens of colleagues congratulated me. Comments like, "Future Colonel and family must be proud," appeared. Ariel liked each one. I felt a familiar weight shift in my chest. Not pride, but something else, something tight and cold. A message followed a few hours later. "Let's catch up this weekend." "Miss you?" I stared at it long enough to know where this was going. I remembered her words from that night. "They're just scared." I decided to say yes. We met at a small bakery cafe near our parents' neighbourhood on a mid-morning Saturday. The place smelled like fresh bread and roasted coffee, the kind of neutral territory parents approved. Ariel waited at a corner table, her posture slightly too straight, her smile fading when I walked in. I sat across from her without hugging or reaching out. She fidgeted with a napkin before speaking. "Congrats," she said, voice low. "For the photo! Thanks," I said, watching steam rise from her latte. She nodded. "I'm proud." I didn't respond. I just waited for her to continue. She sighed. "You look good." I offered a small smile. "It's been a good year." She glanced around, leaned in closer. "Actually, I made your favourite banana cake." "I know it's been forever since we had one." She slid a small box toward me. Inside, I saw several slices of dense cake frosting, still soft, and little flecks of chocolate. It smelled like home. My chest softened. "Thanks," I said again. I took a bite, moist, familiar. I closed my eyes briefly. She watched me, as if measuring how much I appreciated it. I turned to sip coffee, and when I looked back, she was fiddling with the cake, lifting a fork as if to taste it herself. She paused, turned, and gestured toward a tiny capsule beneath the crumbs on the plate. "Just fruit extract," she said, voice steady. "Helps nerves." I didn't question it. Instead, I nodded and continued eating. Behind the calm veneer, I sensed something else. A note dropped into my gut truths. And something more fragile hope. Maybe something like trust. 2 days later, I received a call from my commanding officer. My routine drug test had flagged something an unauthorized stimulant, typical of performance-enhancing or alertness pills. My promotion was put on hold pending investigation. I felt the ground drop somewhere between pride and betrayal. The first text I sent was to Ariel asking if she'd had any of the cake. Her reply came instantly, "I didn't know." That morning, I replayed every detail of our meeting. Quick decisions and fast habits became suspect. My silence turned inward, heavy and aching. Under military protocol, I had to secure my own evidence. I returned to the cafe under a research pretext, found our table, and asked to review the security footage from Saturday morning. The manager, after reading my ID and hearing formal review, switched off background music and handed me the login credentials to the encrypted camera feed. I sat on a stool, watching the timestamp move frame by frame until I saw Ariel. She placed a small capsule into the cake while my back was turned. My heart flattened. No anger, yet just cold recognition. I copied the segment, sent it to legal counsel, with an attached note, "I do not seek charges. I ask for a fair review. My reputation is all I have." They cleared me within 2 weeks. No finding of deliberate impairment on my part. The chain of command accepted that it was an isolated incident. "Make sure it never happens again," the CO told me. No further mention of promotion delay. The pause stayed, though, a small scar. I didn't confront Ariel. I didn't call. I didn't demand answers. I just continued on, quieter than before, but more careful. A seed of resolve planted. After that, I dove into every assignment with more focus, more determination. I studied, longer trained, harder stayed visible for all the right reasons. The cake I never ate again. Even so, the shadow of that afternoon hung over me like a mycelium under soil, unseen but powerful. It wasn't until a routine drug screen came back positive for a stimulant that I realized how far-reaching that small moment in the cafe had become. They called me to the commander's office, a sterile room with one window and 2 chairs. I sat there in my uniform, boots polished ribbons flat against my chest, listening to the words I never thought would come from someone who called me, "Colonel, you're temporarily suspended pending a full investigation." My head pounded, not with fear, but with a chilling clarity. They thought I'd cheated. They thought I'd lied to get ahead. I stood up, told them I would cooperate fully, and left without another word. In the bathroom down the hall, I splashed cold water on my face and looked at my reflection. Every line in my uniform held its own story. This test, this mistake I didn't make, it threatened more than my rank. It threatened the part of me that had built everything on silence and perseverance. I pressed my forehead against the cool tile until the murmurs outside faded. Then, I remembered Marble and Grind Table 4, Saturday morning. I remembered Ariel's hand. I remembered the capsule. I reached out to my military lawyer and asked if I could request security footage. They said yes under formal procedure. The next morning in uniform, I drove to the cafe. The manager led me to a back office where a grainy screen showed the breakfast rush. I pointed to the timestamp. He paused, rewound. I watched heart rigid as Ariel lifted her hand, dropped the capsule onto my cake, and slid it back into her lap. I didn't flinch. I asked him to burn a copy and place it on a secured USB. He did quietly. He even looked away when I clutched the drive in my palm. No words passed between us. At the base, I handed the flash drive to my counsel and wrote a 1-page memo to the board, requesting only that my name be cleared. I added that I did not wish Ariel any legal consequences. I did want my record intact. The board met 2 weeks later in a small conference room. My attorney and I sat in silence as we watched them review the capsule evidence. The chairs were too close, the tension tight. When the chairman finally spoke, I felt relief wash over me. They acknowledged the stimulant came from an external source, and that I had no knowledge of it. My suspension was lifted, and though my promotion was still pending final review, they restored my status. I nodded and saluted, voice steady, when I said, "Thank you, sir." Later, standing outside the building, I allowed myself the first deep breath I could remember taking all week. I wasn't celebrating, I was relieved. I felt the edges of my resolve harden. That night in my quarters, I placed the USB on my desk. It glinted silently under the desk lamp. I didn't open it, I just let it be my proof, my truth. I sent Ariel a text. There are lines. They were crossed. I won't forget. I didn't follow it with questions. I didn't expect answers. I just knew she would read it, and she would remember. Then I gathered more than clothes and gear documents, strategic plans, research outlines. I packed them with care, each file a brick in the foundation I was rebuilding. As I shut off the lights, I realized something important. This wasn't just survival or defense anymore. It was transformation. I had been pushed to the edge, tested by family and system alike. And I had held. I had protected myself with truth and integrity, more powerful armor than any uniform or rank. Tonight, I didn't sleep. I planned. Not revenge, progress. My future wasn't uncertain anymore. But progress doesn't mean peace. The next morning I woke, early walked the base in silence and sent Ariel a message. It was short. I got suspended. Don't worry, I'll figure it out. I didn't say I had been cleared or that the board had already restored my standing. I didn't want to. I wanted to know what she would say if she thought I had truly fallen. She replied quickly, "Maybe it's time to come home. You can still teach like Mum. People trust you." That's something. That last line got to me. People trust you. I wondered if she'd even trusted me enough to believe I didn't know what was in that cake. Or had she trusted I'd never fight back? I sat with her words longer than I care to admit. My fingers hovered over the screen, typing and deleting 3 different replies before I gave up. I didn't answer. I went back to my duffel and began packing. Not for home, not for comfort, for reassignment. That same day, I submitted a request to transfer far from the capital, far from the base where everyone now knew too much. I didn't want eyes on me. I wanted work. I wanted a place where no one cared who your family was or how close you came to losing it all. The request was approved by the week's end. Remote post, cold climate, high turnover, nothing fancy. That was the point. A few officers reached out to ask why I'd accepted such a backwater assignment. "This place doesn't fit someone with your track," one of them said. I told them I wanted the quiet. That was partly true. I wanted space to think, to rebuild, to grow in silence. I didn't need more noise. I needed my own rhythm again. The day before I left, I received a package from command with my new assignment papers and a short note from my superior. It read, "Ashcroft, you took a hit and stood tall. We noticed." That was the only affirmation I needed. It didn't erase what happened. It didn't forgive it, but it acknowledged that I hadn't been broken. I sent Ariel one last message before my transfer. "I'm moving out for a while. Training post. No city, no lights, just me and work." She replied with a thumbs up emoji and a sentence. "Let me know if you need anything." No apology, no mention of the past. Just that. Like we were casual acquaintances, not sisters bound by blood silence and one nearly career-ending betrayal. I boarded the transport at dawn. The windows fogged as we moved away from the only station I'd called home for years. I didn't look back. The further we went, the clearer I felt. Somewhere along the winding mountain roads, I realized I hadn't thought about rank in hours. I thought about character, about how you keep going when it's just you and your principles. That's all the military had ever taught me that stuck. The new base was small 2-long buildings and a makeshift field for drills. The air smelled of pine and metal. It was colder, windier, less formal. I liked that. I settled into my quarters. Without ceremony, put my name tape on the door, LTC Ashcroft. Then I unpacked uniforms, field manuals, and a worn copy of On War by Clausewitz. A gift from an old instructor, a reminder of what I'd come here to protect, not the job, but the discipline that built it. My first day, no one knew me. That was the best part. I ran morning PT, handed out notes, fixed a broken radio by hand. At night, I sat on the narrow bunk and scribbled new plans for training rotations. I felt useful again. I didn't check my phone for days. When I finally did, Ariel had sent one more message. "Hope the quiet helps. Let me know if you want to talk." I didn't respond. Maybe one day I would. Maybe not. But right now I had soldiers to train, a reputation to rebuild, and a silence I was finally comfortable inside. I closed my eyes that night, not to forget, but to continue. 10 years passed in that remote posting. I spent them building more than a career. I built purpose. I earned my lieutenant colonel rank through grit and results, not legacy or privilege. I earned it by quietly spearheading the development of a battlefield AI system I named Sentinel Edge, designed to optimize troop movements, reduce civilian harm, and predict threats. I funded it through grants. I coded lines in late-night shifts. I ran field simulations in muddy fields at dawn. Eventually, after presentations to higher command and peer reviews, the system was approved for wider use and integrated into tactical protocols. That was the day I finally let myself feel proud, not for a title, but for impact. Somewhere in those years, a former patient of my mother's, a veteran named Carlisle, became convinced of Sentinel Edge's potential. He met with me once in passing at a military summit. We talked data, strategy, ethics. He was precise and humble, reminding me of his therapy sessions with my mother Emily long before I made waves. I never used his full name in any briefing. His presence was extra. But he believed in what I built. And then one day he contacted my parents unprompted. They were at a medical conference celebrating Mother's latest publication when a familiar face approached. Carlisle, mid-50s reserved, introduced himself to them as a former patient of Emily's. "Your work saved me," he told her quietly. Then, to my father, he spoke of the discipline and moral clarity he gained through therapy. My parents, proud and honoured, accepted his thanks. Carlisle didn't mention me. But then he extended an invitation, a seminar on emerging applications of AI in battlefield medicine and strategy. "It's connected to someone I think you should meet," he told them. My parents were intrigued, no details, no names. But Carlisle impressed them with his tone of quiet authority. They accepted. I didn't know until a week before the event that they planned to attend. Carlisle called me briefly professionally to let me know my family would be there. He didn't ask permission. It didn't matter. He just said they'll see it on their own terms. That day, they arrived at the grand auditorium dressed impeccably. They weren't expecting me. They were expecting a medical panel with slides on PTSD recovery and battlefield triage. They didn't expect a soldier in uniform. They certainly didn't expect the presentation title to be Sentinel Edge. For the soldiers we forget. Carlisle sat to the side watching. 8 hours later, they would walk away changed, but that morning they sat comfortably in rows of white folding chairs, awaiting insights on psychological resilience and veteran health. I waited behind the curtained stage. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with controlled calm. No fanfare, no announcer with my name. Just me, in uniform, facing an audience filled with doctors, strategists, and unannounced, but present my family. Carlisle stood, introduced the panel, and then walked directly into telling them, "You've heard from the medical side. Now you'll hear from the field. From someone who has lived this complexity, military and medical, someone who built the tool you're about to see." He paused, and I stepped forward, saluting, though no one asked. He clicked. The lights dimmed. My voice cut through the hush. "God bless the work you do to save minds. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lena Ashcroft. I'm thankful to sit behind your ranks, but today, I'm here to show you what happens when strategy meets empathy, data fights, collateral damage, and discipline meets humanity. Slides, shifted maps, heat signatures, predictive models." My parents sat unmoving. Mum's hand gripped Dad's purse. Ariel sat next to her, leaning forward. Every chart I explained was a story of my work of late nights and quiet breakthroughs, of soldiers who'd gone home safe, of villages never disrupted, of problems solved without bombs. Each word was measured, personal, precise. I didn't call out my family. I didn't need to. Carlyle's final slide read, "Sentinel Edge was built by Captain Turned LTC, who saw both sides of this fight and refused to let anyone be forgotten." The room erupted in questions and applause. My family remained silent, stunned. Afterward, Carlyle guided them backstage. I waited by the exit door. Dad was first, his eyes wide. "You built this?" he asked, voice quiet enough no one else heard. I nodded. "It's not what I do at home, but it's who I am." Mum touched the podium, tears silent. "Lena?" Ariel stood beside her, mouth open. They didn't embrace me, but Dad raised his hand in a salute, imperfect, reluctant human. I returned it. That moment wasn't the culmination, it was the unlock. It proved that sometimes the proof isn't in conversation. It's in the unspoken acknowledgement, in the respect earned and returned, in being seen not as a case or an asset, but as a person. We slipped out together onto the hallways. None of us needed to speak. The tension didn't vanish, but it shifted. It was no longer about misunderstanding or doubt. It was about recognition. 2 days later, Carlyle followed up with me. They needed that he said, "You gave it to them. He was right." But that wasn't the end. Recognition is a moment. Understanding takes longer. The event was scheduled a week later at the Alliance Hall downtown, a wide marble-lined venue where general scientists and policy wonks all sat on the same level. I arrived early as I always did. Checked the projection, ran the deck, paced the backstage corridor with a paper coffee cup I didn't drink. I wasn't nervous about the content. Sentinel Edge had already been field-tested, peer-reviewed and classified under multiple tiers of military protocol. What made my hands sweat was the knowledge that my parents and sister were somewhere out there in that sea of polished shoes and clipped ID badges. Not because I'd invited them, they hadn't known I was speaking. Carlyle had been strategic. He knew exactly how to position it, a major presentation on AI-assisted battlefield triage and predictive trauma support. The kind of thing that attracted defense psychologists and neurotherapy experts like my mum. He didn't mention names. He just said, "It's something you'll want to witness firsthand." So they came. I stood behind the thick velvet curtain, listening to the hum of pre-panel chatter. Laughter from one row, the shuffle of coats being folded over knees. I leaned to peek through the gap. There they were, my mother adjusting her glasses as she scanned the program, my father flipping through the abstract with his usual furrowed skepticism, and Ariel scrolling something on her phone, then elbowing Mom with a quiet comment. Carlyle was already seated near the stage exit, hands folded neatly in his lap. He caught my eye and gave a single nod. I pulled back, breathed. The MC walked to the podium and tapped the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for Session 2, Technology in Tactical Medicine. Our next presentation is led by one of the military's most forward-looking strategists. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Lena Ashcroft." The spotlight cut across the stage as I stepped into it. The applause was polite, professional, mostly curious. But I wasn't watching the audience. I was watching 3 faces, and those 3 froze. My father sat back, slightly blinking. My mother's hand flew to her chest. Ariel let out a sound, maybe a laugh, maybe a gasp, and lowered her phone. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady. "I'm here to discuss a system developed over the past 7 years under conditions not typically associated with innovation, mud, blood fatigue, and silence." I clicked through the first slide, troop formations, with overlay paths calculated by the AI's neural networks. We call it Sentinel Edge. It doesn't replace human judgment. It sharpens it. It saved lives not just of our own, but of civilians in crossfire zones. because real precision is not about bullets, it's about decisions. As I moved through data models, heat maps, case studies, I didn't look directly at them again. I let the material speak, the science, the outcomes. I told stories, not personal ones, but real ones. A medic who used the algorithm to reroute around a planned strike, saving an entire village. A squad that avoided an ambush because the system flagged an anomaly others missed. These weren't hypotheticals. These were victories without violence. I closed with a simple sentence. This is how we remember the forgotten, by refusing to make them collateral. The applause this time was louder, longer. As it faded, I stepped down from the podium and moved behind the curtain again, not waiting to see what they would do. I needed air, not contact. But 10 minutes later, as I stood in the quiet hallway, sipping finally from the now lukewarm coffee, I heard a voice. That was quite something. My father. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. You didn't put your name on the program. Didn't want to make it about me, I said. Just the work. He nodded slowly, then looked at me for a long time. You built all that with a team, I answered. But yeah, I led it. My mother appeared next, walking softly. Why didn't you tell us? Would it have mattered? I asked. She didn't answer. Ariel lingered behind them, eyes red, not crying, not quite. There was no group hug, no apologies, but there was a stillness, a sort of recalibration. My father opened his mouth like he was about to say more, then just said, Colonel. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was the first time he'd said my title aloud. That was enough. The lights dimmed and shifted as the master of ceremonies approached the podium, crisp in his charcoal suit. He cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker requires no introduction for some, but deserves one nonetheless. Pausing, he swept his gaze across the audience. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Lena Ashcroft. A spotlight bloomed on stage, catching the shine of medal ribbons on my uniform. I walked forward, my boots muted on the carpeted floor, each step anchored by years of training and grit. My heart thudded, not from nerves, but from purpose. In the hushed auditorium, the tension was palpable, a strategic pivot point in my life, and unknowingly, theirs. Dad's tie quivered as he turned his head to Mom. Ariel swallowed just loud enough to betray herself. Their eyes found mine. It was the first time we were really meeting through the prism of who I'd become. I paused, center stage light, haloing around me, projecting authority I'd earned at every cost. I looked out at their faces but didn't stop speaking. Thank you, I began, voice even. The last time I stood before you like this, I was neither seen nor understood. Today, I stand for every voice we've overlooked in conflict. Today, I speak not because of privilege, but because of purpose. Slides lit up the screen behind me, strategic deployment maps, blueprints of civilian protection zones, reconstruction metrics. The room was silent, engaged. My family watched me lead them through the narrative arc of Sentinel Edge, from inception to deployment, each milestone grounded in lives saved and harm prevented. I described field operations, where medics guided by predictive AI reached wounded civilians faster than ever before. I detailed unsung partnerships between platoons and local NGOs. No heroics, no grandstanding, just outcomes, data, tangible change. When I finished, the audience erupted into applause, moderate, respectful, and wholly earned. But my focus wasn't the crowd. It was them, Dad straightening, Mum's lips parted, Ariel cupping her hand over her mouth, disbelief flashing in her eyes. The applause swelled as I saluted and turned to exit the stage. Backstage, Carlyle appeared first. He offered a proud nod, his presence a quiet acknowledgement that he'd helped set this moment in motion. I caught his eye, the unspoken, well done crystal clear. Then they were behind me first, Dad. He cleared his throat. Colonel Ashcroft, he said softly and extended a hand. No backpats, no accusations, just recognition. I shook his hand. Mum came next sudden and gentle. She squeezed my shoulder and whispered, I'm proud of you. Those 3 words were heavier and more meaningful than any medal. Ariel hovered, tears in her eyes, speechless. I offered her my hand, and after a moment she took it. The MC returned to the room. That was Dr. Emily Ashcroft and Mr. James Ashcroft. Please join their daughter on stage. A ripple of surprise passed through the audience. They rose slowly, joining me under the lights. We stood a family united in front of hundreds of witnesses full circle. I introduced them. This is my mum, Dr. Emily Ashcroft, a pioneer in trauma therapy, and my father James Ashcroft, a veteran, and now a medical ethicist. Mum's eyes widened. Dad nodded taut with pride. Ariel stood beside them, awkward but present. The audience applauded again. My pulse stilled. We had crossed the point of no return, moving from silence and misunderstanding into a shared space where identity and love didn't cancel one another out. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. A moment of understanding passed between us. I had carried their expectations, their disappointments, their pride, and reframed them on my own terms. They had come to see not the uniform or the technology, but the person. And I had stopped pretending that silence was safety. In that second, I owned my voice, my choices, and they owned theirs. The event closed. Family photos snapped. Handshakes exchanged. No long speeches, no public theatrics, just the quiet aftermath of acknowledgement. We left together, the 3 of them circling around me, each step more familiar than it had been in years. That night, I lay in the quiet hum of my quarters, the day's weight settling in. Not exhaustion, gratitude. Change had come not with fireworks, but with a steady beam of truth. It was quiet in my quarters that morning, the kind of quiet that felt empty in a different way than before, like the calm after a storm where the damage is visible, but the air is clear. I pressed my uniform, placing the rank insignia carefully. Today, I wasn't just giving a presentation. I was telling my story through their stories, through our work. By midday, the auditorium was buzzing with anticipation. I walked in with my team, all in civilian attire, blending into the crowd. I climbed the steps onto the stage again, the lights dimmed except for the spotlight I stood in. This time, there were no introductions, no slides before the moment, just me and the auditorium. I looked out and saw them, my parents in the front row, Dad sitting rigidly, Mum's fingers twisting in her lap. Ariel next to them, face unreadable, and Carlisle seated off to the side, hands folded, waiting. I pushed the remote. The screen behind me lit up with images, my unit. Rows of faces, older soldiers, bright-eyed recruits, women warriors, some younger than me, some older, some bruised by life, all once overlooked or underestimated. Now partners, now alive. I took a breath. My team here, I call them the forgotten ones, the ones written off before they even raised a weapon. They were dismissed for age, for background, for fallibility. I paused, watching the images shift slowly. And how often in our own homes do we dismiss someone we love for who they are not, for what they've done, but for what we expected them to do? The click. The slide changed to a close-up grid of faces. Civilians, rescued lives, redirected collateral damage prevented. That is Sentinel Edge. I allowed that to resonate a beat. Then, you treated thousands of wounded minds, Mum, Dad. But have you ever let someone heal by simply listening, by letting them speak in silence and acknowledging their path? My voice dropped and I turned to face them. Have you ever listened to me? A hush fell. I felt every strained breath in the room. I watched my father's eyes flick to my mother's. I saw her abdomen move, inhale and hold. Ariel's hand flew to her mouth, tears glistening. Carlyle stared at me, chest tightening, before he stood. I continued. These soldiers, these men and women are proof, not of failure, but of redemption. That dignity isn't restored by speeches or accolades, it's restored by action. I let that sit. Then, a cadence clicked through the room, the sound of Carlyle standing his chair, folding slowly as his feet met the floor. He faced me, stood straight, and saluted. Over the seats, the hush broke into respectful silence. Then, he said, "Ma'am, Colonel Ashcroft." His voice was steady, formal, resonant. It echoed through the auditorium. That salute didn't just honour a rank, it honoured a journey, a woman's fight to be seen by her father, by her sister, by the profession she chose. My heart clenched. I nodded, slowly holding his gaze a moment longer, before turning back to the seated crowd. When he sat, the room shifted. People stood in reverence. Papers rustled, chairs creaked. The echo of collective realization passed like a breath. My parents sat frozen. Dad's jaw clenched and unclenched. Mom closed her eyes and inhaled, exhaling in a single shuddering gesture. Ariel leaned forward, arms pressed against her thighs. I clicked the next slide, a tribute to every member of my team, named and acknowledged for their contributions. Their faces shone with pride, no longer in shadows. I wrapped up, voice soft but certain. This is how we remember the overlooked, by giving them back their voice, and by giving ourselves permission to truly listen. Light applause gathered, growing until the whole auditorium stood. I stood tall, letting it wash over me. My heart pounded, not from adrenaline, but from relief. Finally, my voice had broken a silence, my family's and a generation of overlooked service. Backstage, I stepped off the dais. Carlyle shook my hand, his expression one of quiet pride. Then, I saw them, my parents and Ariel, waiting. They didn't hug me. They didn't tear up. But their presence was enough. Dad stepped forward. His eyes glistened. "Colonel Ashcroft," he said softly. "A simple acknowledgement, a salutation earned." Mum reached out and touched my arm. Her voice raw, "I heard you." Ariel took a step closer, half turned away, voice breaking. I didn't understand. I'm sorry, I ignored you." I reached out and squeezed her hand gently. Eyes steady, but warm. "Thank you." We stood in the silent hall, no audience, no applause, just the echo of what we'd witnessed together. This wasn't forgiveness, it was empathy. It was the sound of hearts opening. That evening, settling into my quarters, I reflected on that moment. It was more than recognition. It was connection. I had spoken truth. They had listened. And sometimes that's the strongest weapon we have. But true healing often happens not on stage, but one conversation at a time. A few days later, I was packing for my upcoming deployment when my phone buzzed. It was Ariel. Her message read, "Did you know about the cake?" I froze. That small, shy question carried years of weight. I typed back, "Yes." I held my breath as the phone spun. "Finally, I'm sorry." 3 words that felt heavy and uncertain. Minutes passed, then I responded I knew who did it. Her reply arrived almost immediately. "Why didn't you report me?" I looked around the room. Uniforms hung neatly, medals arranged on the dresser. I sat down, phone in hand. "Because I didn't want you to become what they wanted me to be." I hit send before I could rethink it. My screen froze. Then Ariel called. I answered. "Lena," she began, voice low, strained. I thought dealing you would fix everything. I thought if I couldn't be who they wanted, at least I could stop you from being her." She swallowed. I was jealous. I closed my eyes, picturing the day she'd slipped that capsule into my pastry, her nerves, her hesitation, the desperate plea in her eyes. "I know," I said. That moment made me choose silence. "I saw you," she whispered. "You left everything, the family, the life, the expectations. You dared to think for yourself. Her voice cracked. I hated that. The truth hung in the space between us. I folded my hands, pushing tension from my shoulders. You're not nothing, Ariel. You're brilliant, creative. But you got stuck in fear of being disowned, fear of disappointing them. She sniffled overhead. I never said it out loud. I was scared of failing. Her words stabbed. I understood her more than she realized. I'd been too scared of betrayal, scared of silence. We stayed on the call for hours. She said I had nightmares, that I'd ruined everything. I shared how it felt to rebuild a reputation, crushed by someone I loved. We talked about how we'd both needed to break free in different ways. No shouting, no blame, just confession and calm. Over the next days, our messages grew slowly friendly. She sent me photos of sketchbooks and drawings she'd hidden from my mother's study art she'd made late at night, fragile and hopeful. She wrote, "I'm trying to find my voice too." I replied, encouraging her to pursue what made her feel seen. "Your talent is yours alone," I typed. "It doesn't need approval to exist." Each message brought us closer, a bridge hard won through honesty and empathy. A week before I left for deployment, she appeared at the base gate unannounced. I saw her standing in the morning light hair, tied back, wearing my old sweatshirt and carrying a folded-up portfolio. I stepped through the portal, watching her shoulders stay squared unsure. "Here," she said, extending the portfolio. "For you." Inside were her drawings, personal, bold, scattered with lines of emotion, and a family photo from years ago, smiling at a holiday dinner, arms around each other. I flipped through, feeling a warmth spread from my chest to my eyes. I took a long breath, then I leaned in and hugged her. Not a quick embrace, but a slow, steady hold, the kind we'd both denied for so long. Her breath hitched. We held each other until the world felt quiet. Breaking away, I said I didn't have to tell you, but I want you to know I always knew the real you. She looked up, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, sister." I placed a hand on her arm. "You belong here with me, with us, whatever you choose." She nodded, voice unclear. Then said softly, "I want to try." I squeezed her hand. "That's all that matters." We stood together as the morning light grew stronger. I had deployment on the horizon, responsibilities elsewhere, but for that moment, it was just us. Sisters rebuilding trust. I watched her turn, walking back off base with her portfolio under her arm. As I headed toward a transport, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Not completion, not perfection, but a beginning. I realized that success isn't a rank or a speech. It's the relationships we mend, the bridges we build, the truth we finally share. I didn't need revenge. I needed empathy. And Ariel needed to see herself too. I stepped onto the bus. My uniform pressed my resolve steady. We might not have fixed everything, but we'd opened a new path. And sometimes that's the strongest victory of all. Months later, we gathered around our family table oval, scarred by years of holiday meals, stacks of textbooks, spilled coffee. But this time, the conversation didn't start with resumes or accolades, no record of ranks, no awards listed like trophies on a shelf. Instead, steam curled from bowls of chili and afternoon light warm on the wood. Our parents sat opposite each other, faces softened. Ariel sat next to me, clutching something beneath the table. I pulled out a small rectangular box, smooth and matte black, with art set printed in clean white letters. I placed it before her. She looked surprised, then shy as I continued. "I've been thinking. Not every effort is on a battlefield. Some battles are personal. We spend time proving ourselves to anyone but ourselves. Today, I want to do something different." I opened the box. Rows of pencils, charcoal sticks, fine liners, all the tools of a creator. I slid one toward Ariel. "If you want to start again, today at this table you still have time." Ariel's lips quivered. She touched the supplies. Mum's hand flew across the table. Dad leaned in, voice gentle. Do you still draw? Ariel nodded, blinking back tears. I heard myself take a breath. We've spent too long defining ourselves by someone else's expectations. I looked around the woman who'd chosen a uniform and a mission, and the sister who'd buried her dreams to keep the peace. This table used to feel like a trial. Today, it feels like home. My mother cleared her throat. I never realized how quiet it was without you, Lena. She reached out, squeezing my hand. And I didn't know what we lost with Ariel's sketches. I watched Ariel exhale the tension bleeding out of her shoulders. Dad nodded, resting his hands on the table. It's been a different kind of honor to understand you both better. His voice cracked. The apology wasn't direct, but it didn't need to be. In his eyes, I saw something shift, the old rigidity softening. Ariel looked around, voice trembling. I thought I had to be perfect here. She gestured to the therapy books the degree framed on the wall. But every time I drew, I felt something real. Maybe it's time to stop hiding that. She took a pencil and flashed a half smile. Maybe even share a sketch with you all. Mum leaned forward. We'd like that. Dad nodded again. The air felt lighter. I realised then that this is what we had worked toward, not dramatic reveal, not public vindication, but this careful rebuilding at our own table. We ate until the bowls were empty, and the sun warmed the room. No one had to say it all. Contentment hung between us. Later, Ariel slipped away with her sketch pad. I watched her return, placing a thin charcoal drawing face down before us. We leaned in. Dad and Mum exchanged a look, then lifted the paper together, a simple drawing of the family kitchen, the table, the bowls, the window, looking out into spring. It was quiet, honest. Ariel's voice cracked as she said, "This is how I see us. Maybe this is how I start." Mom reached over and hugged her. Dad squeezed Ariel's shoulder. I felt a swell of pride, not for a mission accomplished, but for something deeper. A family remade. I spoke softly. I'm not sure I've ever won, but I know I was the one who stayed. My voice shook, and I looked at each of them in turn. I'm the one who didn't walk away. That's enough. They nodded. Dad cleared his throat. Then, we're proud. No cheers erupted, no medals were pinned, but the quiet warmth in that room, the acceptance, the empathy that was louder than anything. We sat a moment longer. No more words were needed. Plates cleared, dishes washed, the sun sank. Doors opened and closed, but something felt different. Something good. Years from now, when I think back, I won't remember accolades or affirmation. I'll remember this, a moment at our family table filled not with pride in my uniform or chest, but with something harder, belonging. I may not be a conventional victor. I may never have won their full approval in the ways they expected. But I stayed. I grew. I listened. And I opened a door. That's not victory by their standards. Maybe not by mine either. But I'm here, and so are they. For me, that's enough. If you're still sitting at your own version of that table, quiet, unseen, carrying the weight of being misunderstood, please know this: your worth is not determined by who claps when you walk into the room. It's in the quiet choices you make to stay true to yourself. It's in the nights you don't give up. In the moments you keep showing up, fully, honestly, stubbornly. So many of us come from families who define love through achievement, who mistake control for care. And in trying to meet expectations we never agreed to, we forget we're allowed to want something different. We forget that surviving isn't the same as living. But here's the truth. You're allowed to choose your own story. You're allowed to walk away from scripts written by someone else. And sometimes healing doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from carving your own path so clearly that those who once ignored you have no choice but to see you finally. Today, more and more people are finding the courage to break cycles, to step away from perfection, and to choose authenticity even if that means being misunderstood for a while. Whether it's through therapy, journaling, starting over in new careers, or simply learning how to say no without guilt, healing is happening, quietly, every day. If this story meant something to you, if you saw yourself in Lena, in Ariel, in the silence, and the reclaiming, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this coming for those still walking their way home, and I hope one day your table feels like a place you belong to. Thank you for being here. You're not alone.